Why don't we get started every week? For those who don't know me, my name is Tom Stelfox. I'm the Scientific Director of the O'Brien Institute for Public Health. It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome you to today's joint Communal Sciences and O'Brien Institute seminar series. I've been working with Mariko and Fiona, and we're doing a little bit of experimentation here. So you'll notice that our seminar is not Friday. I hate to break the news to you. It's still Thursday. So, it's Thursday. It's noon, and we're up here on the third floor. So we're trying to do a little bit of experimentation to figure out what's the best way to structure and format the seminar series to make it as accessible to members of the department and the institute as possible. You'll also notice there's food at the back for those of you that are here in person. Please take advantage of that. We're trying to entice you with a bit of food and also to maybe make it a little bit more of a positive environment. So thank you for coming. I want to start by acknowledging that today's session is happening on traditional territories with people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Lost Leaf First Nations. And the city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation Alberta Region 3. So today's topic is about grants, right? Grant receivers. And so I'll be candid with you. I have a love-hate relationship. On the one hand, it's really exciting, the new idea and that optimism that comes. There's the hard work, which is a slog. And then there's that most of the time, that real devastating disappointment when you get your results. Followed by some sort of period of reworking things and an eventual joy from getting it, followed by, oh my God, and then in the end, when it's all done, like there's a fair amount of satisfaction with it, right? And then obviously, I read through the process, right? So obviously, the net benefit of it all is such that, of course, at least myself and many others are sitting there through it. Now, we're fortunate today to have a panel of experts here to guide us through thinking through their own experiences and the expertise they've got about how do we think about resubmission, right? How do we ride that roller coaster in a way that makes it, as enjoyable and as productive as possible? Now, before we get into our panel discussion, I wanted to share 3 pieces of data. I don't have slides, I want to keep it simple. First thing is, you know this, national competitions are super competitive, right? So if we look at CIHR, for example, we've timed this just after the newest decisions come out, that basically on average, the funding rate is around 18 to 22%. If I did my math correctly, it looks like it's about 20% for the current round of projects and competitions. So that means 5 good projects go in, lots of effort, one gets, right? Super competitive. When we look at O'Brien data for the last year, we don't quite have all the data yet for the current competition. So I'm referring to the last 2 projects and competitions. If we include priority announcements, O'Brien members have had between a 32 and 47% success rate. Really high. So we should be really proud of that. And it's competitive. The second thing is that we know that internal peer review works. So if we look at the observational data from O'Brien and compare people who use the O'Brien internal peer review process to those who are members who don't use the O'Brien internal peer review process, we see an absolute increase in the last 2 competitions of between 6% and 22%. Right? So if you think if the average, you thought this was random, then there's a 1 in 5 chance or 20% chance you getting funded. By doing internal peer review, you're bumping that up to 26 or potentially higher, maybe even as high as 42%. Big improvement. And the final piece of data I want to share with you is the lesson of persistence. So when we go back and look at the members of the institute who've been funded, the majority of awardees in any given competition are resubmissions. And in fact, we have years where every single award has gone to someone who's a resubmission. Okay. So what that tells us is that as devastating as the projections are, persistence through thoughtful resubmission actually translates. That's where the success rate is. And we just have to recognize that's just part of it. Don't worry. So we've just had CIHR notice of decision. We've got a February 8th registration. That's up to less than a week's time. And so with that, we're going to take advantage of this panel to think a little bit about this. So how does the next hour look like? It's meant to be a conversation. If you're in the room, please raise your hand, speak loudly so people online can hear, and then I might repeat the question to make sure they can hear it. If you're online, please raise your hand or put a question in the chat. Mariko's going to monitor that. And then either ask the question on your behalf, or we can try unmuting you, turning on the mic and having you ask the question. Okay. The goal is for this to be an interactive discussion. I do have a few questions to get us started. That's just because I don't want it to be dead silent. And then hopefully we can end up with a conversation so you get what you need out of this. So let me briefly introduce you to the panelists. So starting at the far left, we've got Dr. Lynn McIntyre, Professor Emerita of Community Health Sciences, and lead for the O'Brien Institute's Public Health IPR process. And Lynn has mentored many people through grant submissions and resubmissions to success. So we're really fortunate to have her come and join us. Beside her is Dr. Nauzer Forbes. Nauzer is an assistant professor of medicine and director of therapeutic endoscopy and training. And he's here to provide an earlier career perspective and someone who's navigated this process with impressive success. So thank you for coming, Nauzer. Beside Nauzer, we have Dr. Sauro. Khara is an assistant professor of community health sciences, and she's a health services researcher in quality safety with surgery and oncology. Also, it's got a really impressive track record of grant success here. And so we're looking forward for her guidance on that. And then finishing us off here at my right is, we all know, Dr. Friedenreich. Christine is a scientific director of cancer epidemiology and prevention and research for Cancer Care Alberta and Alberta Health Services. She's an adjunct professor and division head of preventive oncology and community sciences. Christine has been involved in a ton of these activities. When she, we had close access to the O'Brien Institute. So thank you for coming back. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do is just launch us. So maybe going back to my initial talk about a love-hate relationship. In my experience, when I apply for grants, and especially for the law writing on it, and it's not successful, it can be pretty fun. And so maybe I can ask the panel to comment on their experience and or expertise of working with others. Advice on how to handle that. And then frankly, how do we do that? And Christine, can I put you on the spot to get us started on that?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, this is so topical because I just submitted a grant to CIHR in the fall competition, and I was on pins and needles to see what happened yesterday because I was very close to the cusp. And my grant ranked 10 out of 45, and they funded the top 8. And so I got a bridge grant, well, a priority announcement grant from the breast cancer competition. So, thanks to Brandy sitting here, she reminds all of us that you should always put, that as a possibility that you would like to be considered for those extra bits of funding. So that gave me $100,000 for a year, which is, better than kicking the teeth. It was a lot better than what I had in the previous year competition, where I had the worst experience of my entire career, where my grant was streamlined, I got triaged. I talked to Lynn about it afterwards. God, I've never in my life for 30 years had such a bad review. And it was like quite humbling, and made me stop and say, okay, I'm not going to resubmit right away, because I obviously had to rethink, retrench, think about where I was going with this project. So this project is something that was funded by a CIHR team grant in 2011, and has been funded since then with 5 years of team grant and another 5-year project grant. So it's a cohort study, and it is hard to actually continue getting funding for something like that. But CIHR had already invested $4 million in this cohort study, and so I needed to make sure that I could complete the cohort and do the final bit. So I rethought the entire grant, because what I had submitted in 2021 was essentially one of the sub-projects was looking at biological mechanisms, and the grant panel really didn't like that. So I pulled back and said, okay, I'm just going to try to finish this cohort study, and my sub-project on biological mechanisms was downplayed quite a bit. And they had absolutely no problems with the project. Actually, the only thing that they were stuck on were some of the statistical methods. So I'm going to resubmit right away to the March competition. So I've been down and up many times in my 30-year career. And I was thinking about this when I started. My first 11 grants were funded the first time, which was unbelievable, right? Yeah. But it was a different era, right? So this is, I started my career in the mid 1990s, and the funding success rates were probably 30 to 35%. And I always submitted my grant to multiple agencies. And I sometimes had the experience where it would get completely trashed by one agency, but funded at the same time by another agency. So those were the kinds of things we could do at that time. It did get more difficult with time. And of course, you know, the science evolves and the kinds of flavors of month and things, the kinds of studies that people want change over time. So you have to kind of, you know, evolve always with what you're going to do and think about. But, you know, now resubmissions are pretty common. It's very rare to have a grant fund out the first time around. And so I think we just have to recognize that. Having said that, you have to make sure you don't put your grant in before it's ready to be considered. And we'll be talking about that later. But if you've got something that's, you know, been in once or twice and the feedback is pretty good, it's definitely worth submitting. But you have to look at what that feedback is. But we'll talk about that. Anyway.
Thanks for sharing that. But it's for me, it's super helpful to actually hear that personal story, because sometimes when we get these news, I get into like a bit of a silo thinking like it's just me that's having this experience. And it's nice to hear that people like yourself who had this amazing career also have the ups and downs of great solutions. Anyone else want to share their thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Christine said, it's kind of, you know, like a wave, right? And so I think a lot of it being sort of on the earlier career side is that I've had a lot of great mentorship. And so, you know, a lot of people who've had, you know, varying degrees of success in the competition, kind of just preparing me and weathering me for, you know, this is how it goes. Starting my career, I never even thought, to be honest with you, that I would be putting in my name, you know, into, you know, tri-council funding and things like that. I just didn't think that that's where my career was going to go. And here I am. So I think a lot of it is just the mindset that, you know, when you hit submit, just be prepared, you know, don't get too high, don't get too low ever. And I think that that's kind of helped me a lot. And then, you know, as part of that, just putting things in perspective that, you know, the world is not going to end if I don't get funded this cycle. You know, I've still got, you know, my health, my life, you know, I think just putting it all in perspective has been, you know, a huge game changer for me, just in terms of how I operate, just not getting too high or too low, regardless of the results. And then I think that, to me, the most frustrating thing out of everything about, you know, funding and resubmissions is just the variability, right? So, you know, like Christine said, you know, you might get a terrible score from one reputed agency and then, you know, get funded by another. So, you know, even on a more sort of small scale, that can happen, right? You can get, you know, 2 out of the 3 reviewers who can say, let's fund this today, get a 4.5, and then somebody else. Of course, it's always the reviewer with, you know, like half of a paragraph of notes who says, yeah, no, this is not for me. This didn't really work for me. So that can be a little bit demoralizing, right? If there's not something substantial. The fact that there are literally days, you know, to decide whether you're going to resubmit for the next competition is stressful, right? So I think just having a plan for if you're not funded also helps in advance, just so you've gotten a lot of that out of the way. And you said, you know, if we don't get funded, what's the next move? Are we going to go straight back in? Are we going to work on things? And a lot of that depends, of course, on the feedback, but kind of like global thoughts.
Great, Nauzer. Thank you. You raised a really important point. As we go from the results from the fall competition to the spring competition, is such a tight time that gives very little time. So maybe, unless there's other comments around this, maybe we can talk a little bit about what are some of the considerations we think about what resubmission is. And I got a couple of points here that I do want people to start to ask questions here.
Something that Christine just said. How do you know whether your grant is ready to go back in? I mean, this may be a bigger question around, like, you know, my grant isn't quite ready. Maybe the IPR process will tell you, like, hey, look, you know, so there's just wisdom. But how do you know, like, I need to pull back, I need to wait at least a cycle, because it's nice to just kind of, like, you know, shots on goal, you just keep shooting, even if it's not a great shot, shots on goal, right?
Don't do it. I mean, I've been on grant panels and been chaired of grant panels where we had people put in something that wasn't really should have never been submitted. And it's the worst way to destroy your career right from the get-go, because you'll have a terrible reputation that with those people, they'll say, this person, and it's in the name, right? So to answer that question in the most precise way, I think you have to really look carefully at the kind of comments you're getting, and if they don't like the study design, they don't like the methods, they think the question is stupid, like you have to really look at the gravity of the questions. And if you feel that you've actually got some pretty solid answers for absolutely everything, then you've got a shot. But if you really are uncertain yourself about some of those responses, then it's way better to wait for 6 months, because it usually takes 6 months to write a good grant, right? So wait the 6 months. And I mean, I just had this personal experience, right? From being streamlined to nearly being funded, because I waited and I did all the stuff that they asked me to do. I did the systematic review. I did publish more stuff. I, just gave them all the additional data and analysis that they asked for. But if I hadn't done that, like I would not have felt comfortable going back.
Right, I think it's a really important issue. Why don't we just hear a bit more about this and then we'll come back over.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'd say, first of all, you do put your heart and soul in writing the grant as you submit it. Take that heart and soul out when you get your result, right? Because you can't, that's not the kind of passion you want, because that's where you get angry, resentful, feel judged inappropriately. So you have to really quite take a pause and be a bit dispassionate about it. I really, really think every time there's a resubmit, you need to think fresh. You need to go back to the literature. Are you getting scooped yet? What's happening? None of this like add 2 references to the introduction. Sure. The notion of, I mean, even statistical methods move on, trial science moves on. I mean, really, are you actually on the cutting edge? Are you still there? What was 6 months is not the same. And, and then these big problems will not be taken care of usually by more clever writing. I'm sorry, I wasn't clear about you obviously misinterpreted, right? Mostly, we've gotten rid of really, really bad grant writers. I mean, the competitions at CHR have gone down to as low as 13% in the most vicious times with funding people that had no chance have not been applying for like a decade. So everybody is competitive who's applying, and they've all had different levels of success. So the easy triages are no longer. So you need to really, really think about the substantive issues that can't just be written away. To me, a rapid turnaround is very discrete, lack of clarity, problem, whatever, very discrete, and you can nail it. I can absolutely turn this one around. The systematic review is out. This is now what the WHO has said. There's got to be, those are the ones that are the rapid turnarounds. But mostly you need to really think hard about whether you can do it by the next 6 months, which means starting as soon as you're recovered, starting, in the first 2 weeks. And that is really with the team. We'll talk about some of that. The team has to really get in on where we need to go with this. And the other is that usually you have to jettison a piece, which is what happened there. I mean, there's a weak link to many of your grants, and sometimes it's not essential. And that's the thing you set aside. Put it in another grant competition, get rid of one objective. Those are the less is more is usually. I'd ask everybody to look at that seminar we did on the Beautiful Grant. Those are the first time. The Beautiful Grant is the first time winners. And what did they do? They just did brilliant simplicity. They just spoke to everything. And none of those grants have 17 objectives. They're, so that's what you're also looking for.
I think I always assume I'm not going to get funded, so start my resubmission pretty much as I submit the first one. So like, what do I think? Like, they're probably going to, I have a feeling they may comment on it. A lot of it's from what was identified in peer review, because there is only so much with the timelines that you can do, even from peer review to submission. So I think that this could maybe be improved. So can I do a systematic review? Do I have some data that I could do like a sub-analysis on, and that way I can put that data in? Talk to the team. I think that's another. I rely very, especially as an early career researcher, I rely very heavily on the team that I've assembled for direction, expertise, moral support. Yeah.
There's a bunch of questions online. Are they
Colleen,
related to this?
yes. Just in terms of timing and.
Perfect, yes, so it's bunch by Rico.
Yeah, so Colleen Cuthbert asked, my grant wasn't successful, but I received 1-year bridge funding. She ranked 7 out of 29, 6 were funded. Just wondering if I should resubmit my grant right away and address reviewer comments or wait until I've used some of the bridge funding.
Good questions. What do we
This
think?
happened to me last cycle. So well, 2 cycles I got bridge funding and then I finally got funded. And the way that I did it, I talked a lot with Tom about a strategy because I was ready to resubmit. The comments were fairly minimal. And so one of the comments was that the data source that I was using had been validated. So I just said, I received bridge funding. I'm going to use it to validate it. And then
Did you resubmit right away then?
I did resubmit right away. And I just said that the bridge funding that I received will be used to validate. And I submitted as an appendix. And you can talk all about appendices as another topic, but I included as an appendices the protocol, including ethics application approval for the validation. So that they could see like I was doing, I had a plan in place.
I would go for it. Colleen. Yeah. No.
I mean, then yesterday I recommended the opposite, right? You know, I did, you know, the other thing is that there are competing priorities. So when you have other grants that have to go in, then taking 100,000 and getting a major piece of the work done, lets you have writing time on something else. And, you know, and will get you through one of those 3 objectives being taken off the table because it would have been dealt with by the 100,000. So the issue is you definitely want to be very clear on what you're using it for. It's not just to, you know, keep a research assistant, you know, funded. That's what's really important. So whether you tell it now in your resubmission, which is really a very strategic, or you absolutely tell them what you did with it when you do your resubmission. And now those are things that are very much, you know, sort of so, you know, authentically committed you are to the project.
Great, thanks. Mariko, any other questions around grant resubmission? So why don't we go to Dave?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, do you go back to the same panel and would your approach differ depending on their comments? Like, if you were streamlined, would you go back to the same panel? Because obviously they didn't like it, but the whole committee actually didn't even talk about it. So I'm just not sure, like, do you always go?
Okay, so I guess, yeah, so the question, I should repeat these questions if possible for people online to hear. The question is, how do we think about which panel, the right panel, when our first grant wasn't successful?
Depends on the topic, really,
Yeah.
right, Dana? So if the panel really should understand your grant, it makes sense to go back. I mean, I went back to the same panel because I did look at all the other panels, and none of the other panels even came close to understanding the content of my grant. So then it just means that's where you have to do the retrench and think about it for 6 months at least, and then.
I mean, panel selection in the first place is really an art, you know, and that's why I think the university puts a lot of effort into who's been on those panels, what's their culture, you know, what are you looking for, what's the dominant kind of methods. So I think, you know, the first selection is important. When you're shopping around, because you're going to be telling these new reviewers, like I was shopping and I didn't like that store that I was at. You need to be really clear about why you're changing panels when it's the so-called wrong panel. The whole idea is not to show defensiveness, to show, you know, that really these are thoughtful reviews, they can improve this grant. So I try to caution people from you know, walking away from, you know, a panel. Because they're going to be caught the next time by, you know, it's submitted and was seen by this panel. And this was, you know, sometimes we've also seen the chairs and the SOs take a grant that should have been in their panel and pop and throw it somewhere else that it doesn't really belong for whatever reason. And I think those are things you can justify to say that, you know, this panel seems to be much more aligned to this work.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. I think it's very important in your grant to make sure that you do include the section about the choice of the other panels, because the CHR will use that in helping them to decide where to move it. And sometimes it comes down to the composition of reviewers, because I've been on the chair where we just didn't have the expertise and we have to send it to a different panel. And then hopefully, you know, that they'll treat it well. I mean, you know, even though they have 60 panels, the breadth of science that goes to CHR is so wide that sometimes it's impossible. And so we do sometimes use externals, so that helps. And so you have to complete that section too, for sure, so they know who to go to.
So can I just ask a follow-up question then? So if you are gonna go to a different panel, so you're gonna propose a panel, do you explicitly describe that anywhere in your resubmission, if you consciously make that decision?
Well, I've seen it very cleverly to say, when we were in clinical investigation, they didn't like this. And so now we're emphasizing the health services aspect. And so it's so gentle, it's one liner in my progress statement. And it doesn't look like you're shopping.
And what about addressing the reviewer comments? Are there any strategies that you think about in terms of how we address the comments? Because the comments might come in the form of individual reviews, and depending on the agency and whether you discuss at a committee, we may have to come in the form of sort of a summary that was a scientific officer or something. So any strategies that work really well for you, or really work poorly, we should avoid when we think about our responses.
Yeah, don't be rude.
Yeah. That word offensive.
That sounds very simple. Actually, not always so easy when you're in the middle of that roller coaster, right?
Yeah, no, we just have to be very respectful. And, I always start with the response to the reviewers' comments, because that helps me guide the revision. And I try to synthesize the themes across the three reviewers, and so that I can come up with a dominant theme. You only have 2 pages, so you have to be very succinct and just really highlight what are the really important, fatal flaws in their mind. And if there are minor things, you can sort of let them be off. And then once I've got that really clear, and then all my team have reviewed it and they agreed, I would go and start revising.
I think a lot of it's grant and theater, right? I think, instead of getting defensive or being rude, you just have to eat it. That's the way I approach it. Just eat it and say, oh, sorry for being, unclear when it was abundantly clear. But it's a definite art to it, right? And then, I don't know, to spin it like a slightly sort of from a positive lens, just having reviewed, I feel helps a lot. Just because I don't know, I've just reviewed for one committee, but I found that, the reviews, people really take a lot of time to do them, right? If they're done properly, and, the discussions take a lot of time. And so, I find it's helpful to just think that, their reviews are actually trying to help you get funded. It may not feel like that, especially if you don't get funded or, but to avoid being cynical, and they're actually trying to, find gaps that can be improved, that can potentially help push you across the finish line. So I just find if you answer with that spirit, it sort of can be helpful, if nothing else, just kind of, mentally for you.
Yeah, I think a good dose of humility, right? And it's true, if the majority of grants aren't funded till the second time, there's a reason that they generally do get, as much as I get very angry and defensive in the background, not on paper, he usually does result in a better second submission than the first.
So, and I also think that you need to look again at the reviews after you've done your response reviews and make sure you haven't ignored something. So I've been reading, quite a few in the last few days, and maybe it seemed to be too subtle, or maybe it was like so obvious that I don't want to leave something hanging that was actually a thoughtful comment by a reviewer. And so, sometimes the SO note doesn't say, it'll just say, look at reviews. So that means you need to really make sure you're not going to omit a major thing that might be just offside. The other is that you've got your progress to date and your response to reviews. And I'm finding a lot of conflating where you put too much of what you've done as your response to reviews. And then your response to reviews is more of like a promotional sheet or something. So really be quite careful that the response to reviews, since we've done a systematic review, we publish it, it's really informed, the tightening of the question. And then when your progress to date, is somewhat separate from that, because I'm finding quite a bit of repetition is a waste of space and it annoys everybody. And so when you started reading the lay summary and the abstract and the first introduction, whatever, and it's all the same verbiage, you're wasting everyone's time. So don't be repetitive, because these are precious spaces, right? 12 or so pages. And so be very judicious about how you separate what's in response to reviews and what's your progress report.
Any questions about response to reviews before I move on? Maybe can I follow up on a thread Lynn you mentioned there about progress? There's a little bit about Khara managed it. But research isn't stopped. You submit your grant, we're working constantly. So your program is moving along, right? And then you get the next grant competition, you get this to resubmit. How do we think about the most effective way of conveying that progress in a way that suggests that's really makes your grant compelling? They should not give you money.
I think you have to actually show that you have actually done some research. So if you've done some publications, if you've got some pilot data, if you've done some other work that's going to support your project idea, you need to do that in there. And, the CHR panels are people for wanting to see productivity. So you need to really demonstrate that you have actually been doing something on this topic idea. And if it relates to some of the comments from the reviewers, that's even better. Say, well, yeah, they wanted me to do a systematic review. I've now done it. It's published, and blah, blah, blah.
It actually makes me think of Khara's strategy being really sophisticated to actually start working on the resubmission. Because what happens is you get the results today, right? Or well, I think we have a sense of a year or so ago, and there's a pretty tight time, right? So unless you're going to take a longer stretch, we need time to make that work. So it's got to be a continued process. Other thoughts?
Well, the irony is you don't have any money to do the research you're supposed to be doing, that you're applying for a grant for, and then you're supposed to give your progress. So I think you are allowed some types of honesty, right? That, I think you could actually refresh the literature. You can refresh the, whether this is cutting edge, refresh, how important this is, refresh the numbers about this is a continuing problem and now worse. So there are ways without having to do, pilot data, administrative things that are, some of these are so inexpensive you can't, but there are ways of making your progress to show I am sincere about this project. And this is what I've done to keep this one, important to my mind and where we need to go. The other thing is if you need to do some of these ancillary things, they're all about continuing to support that this is the core. So what we've done now is we've done, these little ancillary projects is preparing us. So what I don't like to see in those ones is basically the CV. I got this award and I did this, whatever. No, I don't, that's not what we're looking for, right? We're looking for, I really care about this project, the goals and objectives of this study. That's what I'm talking about here. And there are other places that people can look about what a superstar you've been in the 6 months that they would, not smart enough to fund you. So it has to be really tailored. And again, I use the word authenticity a lot. This is not contrived. You're supposed to have done some progress. And you can also talk about why you couldn't do progress. And so those are real. There's real high issues, there's real native issues, there's real whatever. They're real, and scientists of basic science have a whole armamentarium of things that are making things not progress. So you can also be honest about the failed attempts and that you had to change. And we've seen that in a lot of community-based research, major changeover in senior staff of your NGOs, having to restart, right? So the progress is getting back on the bicycle. Right? The whole business of resubmission is getting back on the bicycle and going forward. So those are actually also very good stories that show how important this research is, that you're going to get back, get a new partner, work with them, etc.
I just want to that response here. I think that especially for investigators, you may not have a lot to demonstrate yet. But if let's say, I'll give you an example of some of the work that I did. So I did a bunch of case control studies early on in my career, and I could put in a progress report. Okay, I have conducted a case control study of breast cancer. Now I'm going to do one on prostate cancer. So I know how to do this kind of research because I've done it before, and this is what we did. And now we're going to apply it to a new population. So it's more than the CV because you can actually show that you've done some of this work and that you have the capacity to do it. You've got the infrastructure, you've got the knowledge and all that kind of stuff. And I think that will give them, because they're essentially looking for some confirmation that you have the skills, the expertise, the environment, the colleagues, and the infrastructure to be able to do that. So that's also something you can put into that progress as statements. I don't know if you guys can. That's really clear.
I think as an early career, I think you're right, there's less to support your ability to do it on that specific project, especially I changed quite dramatically in terms of population, I started my faculty position, but those kind of transferable skills, like I managed a team, I did some implementation stage during my postdoctoral fellowship, just some of those kind of transferable skills that would be needed to the project that you're doing.
When, this makes me think, when I did my PhD, the head for the section where I did my PhD, Steve Sumeray, said that, this may sound really disingenuous, but he said that, that he always writes a grant for the work he's finished. The reason he does that is, and so the money's used for the future project, it's not how you're supposed to do things. But the reason he does that is because he's got all the pilot data, because it's not pilot, it's the real data. And he's gone through all the feasibility evaluations. Right? But maybe it doesn't sound right. As we think a little bit about progress, there may be ways to think about doing some work that then makes your grant that much more compelling because you've thought through all the limitations and show some pilot data. And if you have to resubmit, you can show there's actually some progress. So in some ways, I can see how it might be nice to be doing some of that work as you're applying. Recognizing that we have to get ourselves into a situation where we're not a step ahead, and that's really challenging, right? For most of us. Any questions from the audience about, incorporating the research progress?
Okay, another question. So nobody's gonna ask a question. Heaven forbid you get it back, you were triaged. You just described that. So, how should one interpret the I got triaged? You don't get an SO note, what do you take away from that? Dana mentioned specifically, like, does that mean that they don't like my grant? Does that mean, how do you internalize that? What do you take away from that?
It depends, if it's the first time submission or if it's the third time submission. Because I have been on panels where we want to give a pretty clear message, we never want to see this grant again. You've tried 3 times and it's just.
And that's usually part of the discussion, right? Like, how are we gonna tell this person, stop coming back, your idea is dead? Yeah, I agree.
No, seriously.
I know.
So we've definitely seen that, but if it's the first time submission and there was just something that was pretty fundamentally wrong with it, then maybe you have to rethink the study design or the methods of the population or something pretty fundamental. So you just have to take a deep dive into it and then go back to your team and take a look and say, what was in here that they really didn't like it? You still get the reviewers' comments, right? And the reviewers are pretty clear usually what they don't like. So you just don't get the summary discussion, and usually the SO notes are pretty short anyway. So I think you just have to hear what you've said.
Other thoughts?
I've been triaged a lot. I think so IPR, and is this worth going in? And then it's tremendously helpful. And one of mine was like, well, it was my first project, CHR. Great comments, not a great score. I'm like, this is a little wastebasket. We reworked it, resubmitted it. I ended up resubmitting to another agency simultaneously. It didn't do well again in CHR, but I did get funded with a different agency. So I think it was consulting people who have more experience in my case to see if it was.
Yeah, the actual score is not what you're talking about, right? 27 out of 34 with SO notes means there was a heck of a debate. And then you just, went down, right? And then getting 27 out of 34 with triage is, you don't know what that means. So it doesn't mean anything, but it does mean it's like serious sober reflection, right? When you've been a triage, and that's when you do the consultation. That's when you have others look at it, and then you have the talk, you have a review of what that means. What I always like is that you want to know what people like. Do they like you? Sometimes you see triage, but you can tell an enthusiasm. They really like this very, prolific, unique investigator. So the likability is really what I'm looking for when I read these reviews about what's going on. Who do they like? Do they like the team? Do they like the setting? Do they like the question? Like, what's their most liked aspect? And when you've got likability, then you can resubmit, fix it up. If it's just technically they're reluctantly saying these faint phrases and all that stuff. They don't like it. There's something that's grating them. And it could be because it's awful. Often it's not. Something grated them. You've got to have your peer group figure out what is it that turns people off on this one. And, and I'm not talking about woke. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about they don't like it. So, this is my little example. I was on a catalyst thing for all these broad things, and I'm sick of yeast mechanisms. Frankly, have we moved on from the, unicellular? Tell me why yeast, right? So there's a world of yeast in health services. Whether it's, there's a world of things that people just don't want to hear about anymore. And so just, even though, you know how to make it real and important, figure that out. So again, there is a gestalt to a grant and to a grant team and to, there's a gestalt, and make this gestalt has to be likable. And then you figure out, how do you navigate towards your strengths? How do you get rid of those annoyances?
I ask a follow-up to Tyler's question. So part of it was about deciding when a grant should be put to rest, right? And you just talked about the fact that most of our success is on resubmissions, right? But that doesn't mean that every grant is submitted enough times to eventually. It's not like a paper. That's why you have a paper. If I start a grant, eventually they'll get to but it's not the case with grants. So I know how can we think about that to get a sense that, let's put this one.
So I had this experience, I've done a lot of randomized control trials, but exercise interventions for cancer prevention. And I went to the RCT panel at CHR, which is really tough because, they like one primary outcome and a very simple, question. And generally I was looking at biologic mechanisms, and I had 10, 15 different outcomes because I was looking at all these different biomarkers, and I thought that was totally reasonable, and I still think it's totally reasonable because that's the actual fact of the physiology of the cancer, is that you have to think about all of these different pathways that are functioning. And so I tried this, it was a combined aerobic and resistance exercise trial. It was beautifully designed. It was designed based on a lot of the stuff that I'd already done. I had a lot of prior experience doing this kind of stuff. And I tried 3 times to get this funded, and that RCT panel just absolutely hated it. And I finally said, okay, the writing's on the wall. I've tried it with different agencies, different panels. This is just not going to get funded because of some fundamental things that people thought we already know. Exercise is important, and who cares whether it's aerobic exercise or resistance exercise? Not thinking, there's a key difference, and it's important, but they didn't care, right? And so, I could keep beating my head against the wall, or just say, I'm going to not do this anymore and not hurt myself and try something else. And so that's what I've done.
Yeah, I think your earlier point about just like that corporate memory within panels is I think super important, right? Like if you don't want to be the person who becomes, not saying this is at all where you were, like, I've been there where people will say, oh, here we go again, like, this mechanism isn't a thing, like this is the only investigator in the world that believes in this, so I think that some of it is just kind of reading between the lines, and I think your co-investigator should be able to help you, especially for, Khara and I, like the more senior people who, should be able to steer us and say, listen, this is just not gonna go anywhere, possibly anywhere, not just within this panel, because the idea is just, it's like beating that horse. So yeah, it's funny how, like, at my early stage, I've started to sort of get these like little themes within the panel where it's like, oh, here we go again with this person. It's the idea is just not going to fly. So whereas I don't know, I've been on the other end where this wasn't for CIHR but for a career board in the States, and I'm just going to give up on it, I think, because my scores are really good every time, and it's just kind of you're not from Harvard, like you're not from UT Southwestern, like all the big sort of clinical hubs in my field. So better luck next time, but nothing really constructive to improve. And so I think I'm just going to read between the lines and just give up on those.
Khara, did you want to answer that question? Because I think when we had a chat, sometimes you're doing obligatory research, and that means it's because of the team wants you to do it, because the funding envelope that you're under for this month at the University of Calgary wants you to do it. Those are not passionate projects. And so sometimes those ones need to be jettisoned. I call it the obligatory research. And so I think, again, some of them, it's hard to be successful when it's not, when you're having to work with less, put it together. So I don't know, that's just what I'm thinking when you did the transition, but I just want to say this, one is when you lost passion for that project, when you've been scooped, it's already like an old question, when it was obligatory and now you don't have to anymore. I think those are the kind of reasons you would jettison as well as what we talked about.
Yeah, and so when I ended up getting funded from a different, an agency, then I was, I'm just happy to take that and accept that it wouldn't be funded through CHR.
That's the other thing, and that's one of our questions that we're going to answer is what do you do with these things that you want to go elsewhere with, but the obligatory funding things where you're trying to do this because of my work situation, just go elsewhere, just give them some money, get it done.
Dana, you got a question?
Yeah, so when you get a priority announcement, can you just ignore it and just say, I'm resubmitting and just kind of not even address the money because you don't have time? And actually for me, like, you can't do anything. So I don't really know what to do. And if I do that, then do I take $100,000 out of my budget, or can I literally just ignore it?
So the
Which is
question
what I
from
wanted to do.
Dana is that when one secures a priority announcement, an envelope of money, but not enough to do the whole project, this one strategically think about that funding in the context of eventually getting to a fully funded application.
I'm just gonna take mine. I haven't done both, right? So I'm just using that money to continue the cohort and I'm just putting it in again. I'm just saying that, this was like 1% of what I actually needed. And so, I'm going to thank them very much and just keep asking for the same thing.
And are you gonna write anything? Like, I personally just wanna not mention it anywhere.
No, you have to acknowledge it because they'll sniff through that right away. You have to be super clear about the funding that you have. If there's any overlap with the current project, if there is overlap, how are you going to use those funds?
Yeah, I guess now it is overlap.
Yeah. So just be transparent, be honest, because if you're not honest, that's going to kill you right away.
So could you say, I'm gonna be cut by 25% when I get the grant. Okay, so I'm just gonna.
That's true.
But yeah,
No, they don't like that. I think Santori is actually talking about not doing across the board cuts anymore. They didn't, I'm not sure. Fran, did you know that answer, or Jenna?
They did it this time.
They did it this time, right? But it's
Sort of kicking that soccer ball down the field, frankly, and we're not ready yet, so it's not gonna happen for this spring. But we're ready to get ready.
Yeah. So, you can build that in a little bit into your budget, just be mindful. Add extra, trainees or add, things that are going to make or break your study if they're not funded. That's, everybody knows.
Yeah, I've
there's a
already done
25%
that,
cut,
yeah.
right? So, so it's something that would be nice to do if you had the funding, but it's not vital for your project.
So do you think though that so I have to mention it, I can't use it now, so basically that means I have to take 100,000 out of my.
Well, do it on Khara, just be open about how you're going to use the funds.
Yeah, and I think the options that I was going with were essentially acknowledging it and taking it out of my budget. Or trying to find a way to use it. So because there was one of the potential flaw that they identified in the study around the data source quality. Well, this might alleviate that problem, plus I can keep my budget the same.
Yeah, I wouldn't drop your budget unless it's because there's really a problem there, because the reality is that very few of us end up in circumstances where we have so much money that we're not using it wisely. Right? So I think Khara's approach, tell them how you're going to use it, put in a budget that reflects the whole project, right? And then see what they need to do with small changes. And you're going to cut. Although I think this Tyler said it's probably being too honest. So can I ask, has anyone ever applied to a special competition in any of the tri-councils?
Yeah.
Yep. So what do you do when you apply to a special competition? It's around COVID, it's around cities or climate or whatever it is, and then you don't get funded. You got this grant, but it's targeted to a special competition. So what do we do with those circumstances? And usually there isn't another special competition right around.
I think in that scenario, Lynn's wisdom is where it would start and end. It's really, it's just, who else, just go back to basics. Who else is potentially doing this? Is the reason that I wasn't funded because there are other people doing this probably better than me, and they recognize that. Is there some way I could spin this around in a really, really timely fashion? Because if it's a special call, there's got to be some sort of, urgency associated with it typically, right? So, really think hard about whether, you're passionate about it enough to drive it and finish it. And if you don't get funded by that source, can you make it happen some other way? I think those are all things that, I submitted to one of the first or second COVID calls and didn't do particularly well, actually, at all. I think I ranked like 80th out of 140 or something like that. So it's like, oh man, like a really high percentage got funded. So it's like, I wasn't even sniffing the funding line, which was probably like 40% or something getting funded for that competition. So I kind of just took the message and, there are other people probably who have better data sets who are more skilled in this domain. I was kind of trying a little bit too hard to fit a square peg into a round hole, I think. And but on the other hand, if this is what you do and you're well equipped to do it and you just missed, then then I think that then you should go for it, right? That just wasn't being in that competition.
That's why I say my submission was one of the very first COVID calls. I wasn't as smart as you. I was like, well, why not put it into a project grant? Didn't do well at all. Unfortunately, another grant, another COVID call came out. I was successful on that one, so they had it already nice and packaged. And I had already started doing a ton of the work, so had the pilot data to support it, but it was not a smart idea.
So these special competitions, they're really good money, and so if you actually can put something that's really aligned, you've got a really good chance. On the other hand, contrived is really not appreciated by reviewers, and they see through it. And the kind of the rhetoric that comes with kind of spin is not at all appreciated by reviewers, even trying to justify. So please don't do that. COVID is one of the yeast situations, right? I think I've definitely seen people trying to turn their COVIDs, into something else, and it just doesn't fly. It's just, and frankly, reviewers are quite sick of COVID, right? That, it was 2018, and then, so I think we have to really figure out how to be fresh about it. But those are for things like climate change, there's some things that are actually less often special competitions. I mean, this, like the monkeypox and the COVIDs, those are pretty, far out there, but there's a lot of special competitions that are for things that are much more in the public health sphere. And we should really think about them and think about the kind of teams that, because they actually also multiply as team grants, as special funding opportunities. So some of these areas are really worth trying out, getting yourself inserted into those teams or leading those teams. Because and so I'm looking at that landscape, like I say, like the climate change, like the environment, like the healthy cities, maybe the digital AI, right? I mean, these are areas that are actually definitely not just visual, right? And if we start positioning ourselves for them, trying it out the smallest, I think we'll actually be quite successful. Because these are not just going to be one-offs. So again, be judicious about turning yourself into and contorting yourself into a special competition. If it's something that's looking for the future, then it's probably a good place to be in the early days of.
That's right. And the success rates are much higher. And those priority announcements can be 40-50%. Like the Institute of Cancer Research had a secondary data analysis competition for $100,000, looking at some of the large cohorts, the CAMPAT, CLSA, those kind of cohorts. And that one has been run over and over and over again. And a lot of people in my group have been successful there. So it's definitely worth being aware of some of those priority announcements. If it aligns with your area of research, it's a quick way.
Okay, I'm cognizant of time. Marika's giving me the signal. But I would like to provide an opportunity for one final comment. Anything that you haven't had a chance to say, that you think is important to share with the participants. Go Go ahead.
I think, so I know, one of your predecessors used to say shots on net, and we've already talked about that, but I think it's eyes on grants instead. I think the more people you can have look at your grant, whether it's IPR, rely on some friendly colleagues, and other mentors, I think that has, it's really pushed forward people's successes of having those lots of people.
In this room, I mean, just to call out the wizards in the
Yeah.
back. Randy, Jamie, Jenna, I mean, use their wisdom, their experience, their resources, because I mean, they're unbelievably fantastic, and I don't think, you know, we take for granted how unique and powerful it is to have such a well-oiled machine with the way DR and ITH, and, you know, it's unbelievable, so, you know, thank you.
I
But,
can totally agree with that. I went through IPR for Charbonneau and O'Brien, and then sent my grant to Brandy, and oh my gosh, what a humbling experience. So I thought, oh, wow, like, there's so many things to do with that. I've had all these other people look at it, so even after 30 years, you know, I'm still benefiting from internal peer review, and clearly my grant did improve a lot. It's really got funded, so, you know, thanks. I'm gonna use her again.
So what I'd say is that you don't want your grant to be wrecked by the resubmission. And you can wreck a grant because you don't stand up for what you believe and what you wanted to stand in the grant. So just, you know, you don't want to just capitulate because they told you they don't like it. If you believe in it, you got to stand for it, and you don't want it to be wrecked. So it's got to be better in your own eyes, not wrecked. And that means you need the integrity to stand up for what you're trying to get people to believe is important.
The other thing that may happen is if you, let's say, got close and got maybe the bridge grant, and then you submitted and your score went down the next time, and I've seen this many times, that's also a really strong message on the panel. You know, if you've been 3 times and you got close, but then finally they said, you know what, you have a fundamental flaw in this design, and no matter what you do, it's never going to get funded, then just walk away.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those really helpful insights. I would say as I listened to this, one takeaway from me is there's obviously, there seems to be a science and an art to resubmissions, and there's a clear process. And so I encourage you to take advantage of our community of experts to help you with your grant, take advantage of the IPR process. I know that requires some vulnerability on our part, and we clearly hear that it translates into impact. I want to thank Mariko, Brittany, Angie, Leslie, for everything they've done to make this possible. I want to thank all of you for attending. I recognize we're in this weird kind of hybrid world. You know, please, those of you online, fill out the survey so that we can continue to improve our events. For those that are here in person, grab food, stay for a few minutes to socialize. And I want to thank you all for everything you do to advance public health for these justice. Thank you, and thank you to our panel. Thank you.